Why did geniuses sometimes write such confusing notation? What was so different back then? Today, if I write something and then see how it could be written in a totally different way to be much clearer, it only takes me a couple of seconds to make changes. But it is easy to forget that what I am doing right now has only been possible since around 1990. So let's go back about 3 centuries and look at what composing was like for Johann Sebastian Bach. At that time, if you wrote something, you didn't change it because it took forever, unless what you wrote was an absolute train wreck that absolutely had to be rewritten. You left it just as it was because changing it was so ridiculously hard. Let's look at Bach's C-sharp minor prelude from the first book of his Well-Tempered Clavier. His idea was to compose a prelude in every single major and minor key, and this idea was totally revolutionary. But C-sharp major was not a key he normally wrote in because he had to retune his keyboard to make it work. Perhaps he simply composed a new prelude in the key of C major and then transposed that prelude up a half tone. But of course we'll never know. In Bach's era, the enharmonic key of D-flat major simply was not used. It is possible that by the time he was half through writing this new piece, or transposing it, he might have said to himself, maybe this would look better in the enharmonic key of D-flat major. But redos took forever, and no one did them unless it was absolutely necessary. So even if he had this idea, he wouldn't have done it because of the ridiculous amount of effort needed. Here is a place right in the middle of this prelude where he has mostly white notes, but in an absolutely miserable key. If you haven't played this piece, imagine trying to play this section from the score. Here is the same thing written without a key signature to make all the sharps and double sharps totally obvious. Look how incredibly hard this is to read. But in the key of D flat, measure 32 is clearly a simple G7 chord, and measure 33 is clearly an F minor chord. So now anyone can read this. My point is that if Bach had the same notation program I'm using right now, he might have done the same thing that I did for my students. He might have flipped the key to D flat major. Here is a second example of something that is extremely hard to read. This is Chopin's octave etude, and it really is almost only octaves and nothing complicated is going on. But suddenly you get an F double sharp 7 chord, and it becomes a total mess to decipher. Here is the same thing without a key signature to make the problem totally obvious. This is insanely hard to read. Now let's look at what Chopin could have written. In this alternate version, which is the only version I teach, if you know how to read music, you'll get it the first time. Why did Chopin write something like this? Well, the answer might be that he was barely out of his teens and he was still following rules that he was taught as a young student. The music itself is pure genius, but perhaps he had not fully developed his own style of notation. It is possible that he might have renotated this short section after writing it if he had a modern program that could do it in a couple seconds. Of course we don't know, but my own answer is yes, he would have. By the time Chopin wrote his E minor prelude, he was a much older man. He had now made original decisions about how to notate. This is the way he should have written one measure according to restrictive rules that are still being taught in universities right now. In measure 24, his C7 chord is called an augmented 6th chord. The rules of that time, and even today, as taught in music schools, demand an A sharp. But in measure 24 he used a B flat, and that means in the next measure he had to write 3 B naturals. So why did he break this old rule? Obviously, because it's easier to read and it made sense to him. In other words, an older Chopin chose common sense over rules of his time, and that is simply what every good composer does. So I think the takeaway of all this is that no one always picks the best, clearest way to notate something the first time. But today, changing our minds is always possible and unbelievably easy to do. The old masters did not have this option. Please don't forget to subscribe to my channel, leave me comments about anything you like, anything you'd like to see in the future, and remember that I consider all suggestions.